The sun was slowly setting on the horizon, painting the sky in golden and orange hues. Billy the Kid, or William H. Bonney, as he was known to the few who truly knew him, was sitting in a small wooden cabin, isolated in the vastness of New Mexico. His eyes, usually filled with energy and boldness, were now dull, reflecting the weight of the years and the choices that had led him to this point. Billy's life had been marked by escapes, confrontations, and a constant pursuit of freedom. But in that moment, he found himself cornered, not only by the law, but by his own ghosts. The echoes of his past actions resonated in his mind, reminding him of the lives he had taken and the promises left unfulfilled. As he watched the fire crackling in the fireplace, Billy thought about his youth, when the world seemed full of possibilities. He remembered when he was just a boy, dreaming of adventures and freedom. But the reality of the Wild West was not made of dreams. It was made of tough choices and relentless consequences. The sound of horse hooves interrupted his thoughts. He stood up quickly, his body still agile despite the years. He looked out the window and saw a figure approaching. It was Pat Garrett, the sheriff who had become obsessed with capturing him. Billy felt a mix of emotions. Garrett was not just an enemy. He was a reflection of everything Billy had lost. They had both been friends in another time, but fate had placed them on opposite sides of the law. The door to the cabin creaked open slowly, and Garrett walked in, his eyes fixed on Billy's. The silence between them was heavy, filled with years of shared history and mutual disappointments. "You knew this was going to happen, Billy," Garrett said, his voice deep, yet without bitterness. Billy looked at him, trying to read his eyes. "I knew," he replied, his voice low, "but that doesn't make it any easier." Garrett took a step forward, removing his hat and holding it in his hands. "I didn't want it to be like this. You were my friend." "I know," Billy said, his eyes softening for a moment. "But what we've done, there's no going back." Silence stretched between them as both reflected on what had been and what could have been. But the distant sound of hooves brought them back to reality. Garrett looked at Billy, his gaze firm. "I came to enforce the law." Billy nodded slowly. "And I came to face what I deserve." The confrontation was inevitable, but in that moment there was a silent understanding between the two men. They had both been shaped by the same unforgiving world, and both had made choices that had brought them to this point. And so, as the sun set on the horizon, lighting the desert with a golden glow, Billy the Kid prepared to face his fate, not with anger or fear, but with the acceptance of a man who knew his journey was coming to an end. Pat Garrett had tracked Billy the Kid for months, each day growing more obsessed with bringing the infamous outlaw to justice. But this wasn't just about the law. Garrett's pursuit was personal, a matter of duty and betrayal. Years ago, they had been friends, young men who shared dreams and hopes under the vast New Mexico skies. Now they were enemies, their paths divergent, leading them to this inevitable confrontation. As Garrett approached Billy's cabin, the weight of the years seemed to press down on him. He wasn't just chasing a fugitive, he was confronting the ghost of the past. The man he had once called a friend was now a wanted criminal, the face of everything that had gone wrong in his life. Billy's crimes had pushed Garrett into a corner, forcing him to choose between loyalty and the law always came first. Billy was no longer the reckless, free-spirited boy who had once smiled at Garrett's side. The man he had become was broken, tired, and hunted. Yet there was something in his eyes that Garrett couldn't ignore, a flicker of the person he had once known. It made the task at hand feel more like a betrayal than a duty. Billy was sitting by the window, his face shadowed by the fading light. He heard the distant sound of hooves, then the unmistakable rhythm of Garrett's horse approaching. His body tensed, not out of fear, but a strange sense of inevitability. The time had come, and he couldn't escape it. He had lived through too many close calls, and this time there would be no way out. Pat Garrett dismounted and stood silently for a moment, gazing at the cabin. His hand rested on the grip of his holstered revolver, a reflex born of years of training and experience. He was ready. But he wasn't just ready to capture Billy. He was ready to face the man who had once been his brother in arms. The door creaked open, And there stood Billy the Kid, his eyes meeting Garrett's. Neither spoke for a moment. It wasn't the kind of silence that could be filled with words. It was a silence thick with years of tension, of regrets, of things left unsaid. The years had turned them into strangers, but the past still clung to them, unwilling to let go. Garrett took a deep breath, his voice rough but steady. "Billy, it's over." Billy's lips twisted into a grim smile, his eyes hardening with a mixture of defiance and resignation. "You think it's that simple, Garrett? You think it's over?" Garrett frowned, his eyes narrowing. "You know it is. You've had your chances. Too many people have died because of you." Billy's hand twitched as if reaching for his gun, but then he stopped himself. His fingers clenched into fists at his sides, his body betraying the weight of the decision he had to make. "And you," he said bitterly, "you've been hunting me for how long now, Garrett? How many men have you killed to catch me? How many times have you turned your back on the man you once called a friend?" Garrett's gaze faltered for a split second, but it was enough. He had to keep his focus. "I'm not here for the past, Billy. I'm here to end it. You're not just a criminal. You're a legend now. But legends die, just like anyone else." Billy laughed, but it was a hollow, empty sound. "And you? You'll be just another man who did what he had to do. No better than me." For a moment, there was nothing but the heavy silence between them. Garrett's mind was a whirlwind, his emotions swirling like a storm. He had known Billy in a different time, when they had shared whiskey and dreams under the same stars. But those days were long gone. Billy had chosen his path, and Garrett had chosen his. Now, they were bound by nothing more than the law and the past. Billy's voice broke the silence again, low and weary. "You don't understand, Garrett. I never had a chance. The world wasn't made for men like me. You think I wanted this life? This curse?" Garrett stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You chose it, Billy. Every step of the way, you chose it." Billy's eyes flashed with something close to pain, a flicker of vulnerability before it was quickly hidden behind his usual bravado. "Yeah, maybe I did," he said, his voice hardening. "But what about you, Garrett? You think you're any different? You think you're better than me because you wear a badge and play by their rules? You sold your soul just like I did." Garrett didn't have an answer for that. He knew the truth of it. They had both sacrificed pieces of themselves, Billy for freedom, Garrett for the law. And in the end, they had both been left empty, chasing shadows of something they could never reclaim. The moment stretched on, neither willing to make the first move. But then Billy's eyes softened, and a strange quietness overtook him. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Garrett," he said quietly. "I know what I've done, but I want you to understand that I didn't want to become this." Garrett's hand trembled ever so slightly. The tension in his chest was unbearable, but he knew what he had to do. He couldn't afford to let this drag on any longer. "I don't want to kill you, Billy," he said, his voice cracking just a little. "But I can't let you go." Billy looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Then do it," he said, a challenge in his tone. "Finish it. I'm not running anymore." The silence that followed Billy's words was heavy, thick with the unspoken history between him and Garrett. They were standing in a standoff, not only with their guns but with their past, a past filled with choices, betrayals, and moments where both men had turned their backs on each other. Billy the Kid, once a boy full of promise, now stood as a man who had lived a life of violence, while Garrett, once his friend, had become an agent of the law, hunting Billy for the crimes he committed. Garrett's hand hovered over his holster, and his heart pounded in his chest. He had known this moment would come. He had dreamed of it countless times, but now that it was here, it felt different. There was no sense of triumph, no relief, just a gnawing feeling of loss. He had been pursuing Billy for so long that in some twisted way, Billy had become a part of him. He had crossed lines he could never erase, choosing the law over a friendship, over a shared past. Billy's eyes never left Garrett's face, his expression a mixture of defiance and resignation. He had made his peace long ago with the fact that he would not die in his bed. His life had been too chaotic, too violent, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the law would catch up to him. But there was something different about Garrett standing before him. Something had changed in the years since they had been friends. The fire in Garrett's eyes was no longer that of a man seeking justice. It was something darker, something driven by duty, not by the man he had once called his friend. "Do it, Garrett," Billy said again, his voice a little more strained. "Finish what you started." "I won't run anymore. You've chased me long enough." Garrett took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had been a man of action for so long, driven by his duty to uphold the law. But in this moment, he felt torn between the man who had been his brother and the sheriff who had sworn to capture him. Could he really pull the trigger on someone he had once shared whiskey and stories with under the same stars? Could he kill a man who had once been his friend? Billy's words echoed in his mind, each syllable like a bullet. "You sold your soul just like I did." Garrett had always believed that his path was the right one, that the law was the only thing that kept the world from descending into chaos. But in the face of Billy, in the face of the boy he had known, the law seemed like a distant echo. There was no simple right or wrong anymore. There was only the past, the weight of their friendship, and the path that had led them to this moment. Billy looked at Garrett with a mix of bitterness and sorrow. "You've been chasing me your whole life, haven't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Chasing me like I'm the monster, like I'm the one who ruined everything. But you're just as trapped as I am, you just don't see it." Garrett clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the grip of his revolver. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to face the truth that Billy was speaking, the truth that, perhaps, he had been chasing a shadow of the past for too long. But Billy was right. Garrett had sold pieces of himself to the law, and in doing so, he had lost the man he once was. And now, standing before him, the ghost of that man, the friend he had lost, was all that remained. "I did what I had to do," Garrett said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm doing my job. I'm the law now, Billy. There's no place for you in this world anymore." Billy laughed, but it was a hollow sound, as though even his laughter was a relic of a life that no longer existed. "The law," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "You think the law's the answer to everything, Garrett? You think you're right, and I'm wrong, just because you've got a badge? You're just like the rest of them. You think you're better than me because you follow orders. But you've lost yourself, Garrett. You lost everything when you decided to be their puppet." Garrett flinched at the words, the sting of Billy's accusation cutting deeper than any bullet ever could. He had spent so many years believing in the righteousness of his cause, but now, faced with the man he had once called a friend, he wondered if he had been wrong all along. For a moment, there was no sound but the wind, rustling the dry leaves around them. Garrett looked into Billy's eyes, searching for some trace of the boy he had known. But all he saw was the hardened man who had taken the life of many, the outlaw who had become a legend. And yet, somewhere beneath that tough exterior, he still saw the flicker of the boy he once knew, the boy who had dreamed of freedom and a better life. "Billy," Garrett said softly, his voice cracking with the weight of what he was about to do. "I'm sorry." Billy looked at him, his face expressionless. "Sorry won't change anything now, Garrett," he said, his voice hardening again. "We've both made our choices, and now we have to face the consequences." The two men stood there, locked in a moment of silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Garrett knew what he had to do. He had known it from the moment he set foot in the cabin. But now, standing face to face with Billy, the reality of it was more than he could bear. "I never wanted to kill you," Garrett said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but you left me no choice." Billy nodded once, as if accepting the inevitability of what was about to happen. "I know," he replied. "I never wanted to die like this, Garrett, but it's the only way." The silence between Garrett and Billy hung thick in the air, heavier than any gunfire or shouting ever could. The moment stretched on like hours, and yet neither man moved. They stood in a standoff not just with their weapons, but with the history between them. Years of friendship, betrayal, and the harsh reality of a life lived in conflict. Garrett's hand hovered near his holster, but he didn't draw his gun. His heart pounded in his chest as if it, too, was questioning whether this was the right moment, the right choice. The man standing before him wasn't just an outlaw. He was someone Garrett had once laughed with, shared campfires with, someone who had once been like a brother. Now Garrett had to make the decision that would end that connection forever. Billy's eyes never wavered from Garrett's face. There was no fear in them, only a quiet resolve. He knew what was coming, and in some strange way, he had been expecting it for years. Billy had always been a fugitive, always running, always in danger. But there had been something about this moment, about seeing Garrett again, that felt different. This wasn't just the end of his life. It was the end of a chapter, a final reckoning between the two men who had once shared dreams. "Garrett," Billy said, breaking the silence with his voice low and steady. "I don't know why you keep hunting me. You think you're doing your duty, but in the end, it's all just noise. It doesn't change anything." Garrett's face tightened at the words. He had heard the accusations before, but hearing them now, from someone he had once called a friend, struck a chord deep inside. He had always justified his pursuit of Billy by telling himself that he was bringing order to the chaos, that the law was more important than the man. But in the quiet of that moment, with the weight of Billy's gaze upon him, the simplicity of that justification seemed hollow. "I'm not doing this because I hate you, Billy," Garrett said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm doing it because I have to. Because the law is bigger than us. It's bigger than you or me." Billy looked at him with an expression that was both sad and defiant. "The law," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "You keep hiding behind that, hiding behind a badge. But in the end, it's just a man's way of controlling others. A way of saying what's right and what's wrong." Garrett felt the sting of Billy's words, as if they had pierced through the armor he had built over the years. He had told himself countless times that what he was doing was right, that it was for the good of society. But now, in this moment, he wasn't sure anymore. Was it the law he was serving? Or was it his own need for redemption? His own need to make sure that Billy, his friend, his brother, wasn't the one who got away, who slipped through his fingers once again. "Maybe you're right," Garrett said quietly, almost to himself. "Maybe it was never about justice. Maybe it was about me." Billy's eyes softened, as if he understood something deeper than the words they were exchanging. "We're all just trying to figure it out, Garrett. We all want to believe we're doing the right thing, but the world isn't that simple." For a moment, the two men stood there, the world around them silent. The wind whispered through the trees, and the sounds of the distant horses and the crackling of the fire in the distance were the only things that broke the stillness. Garrett's grip on his gun tightened, his mind torn between his duty and the man he had once known. Then, without warning, Billy took a step forward, his movements slow but deliberate. "You want to kill me, Garrett? Then do it. I'm not going to beg for mercy. I've lived my life on my terms, and if this is how it ends, then so be it." Garrett looked at Billy, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, a man who followed the law without question. But standing here, in front of the man who had once been his closest companion, Garrett realized something he had never truly admitted to himself. He had been chasing a ghost. The Billy he was hunting was not the same boy he had once known. That boy had died long ago, swallowed by the very world they had lived in. The world that demanded men like Billy be destroyed to maintain control. And yet, despite everything, despite the lives Billy had taken and the law he had broken, Garrett couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. The gun in his hand felt heavier than it ever had before. "Why?" Billy asked, his voice rough with frustration. "Why can't you just do it? You've hunted me all this time, but when the moment comes, you hesitate. You're just like the rest of them. You talk about justice, but you don't have the guts to deliver it when it's right in front of you." The words hit Garrett like a slap in the face. He clenched his jaw, fighting the storm of emotions inside of him. It wasn't that he hesitated because he was afraid to kill Billy. it was because he wasn't sure anymore. He wasn't sure if this was the justice he had always believed in, if this was the end Billy deserved. "I don't want to kill you, Billy," Garrett said, his voice shaking. "But I can't let you go either." Billy's expression softened, the fire in his eyes dimming slightly. "I know," he said quietly. "I know you don't. But you've already made your choice, Garrett. And now, I have to face mine." The silence between them stretched again, the weight of their past and present hanging in the air. Garrett knew the time had come. He could either end it once and for all, or let Billy slip away again, allowing the cycle of violence and pursuit to continue. But in that moment, Garrett understood something. The law, as much as he had clung to it, had never been the answer. It was the choices they made, those moments in between, where the heart and the soul truly mattered, that defined them. With a slow, deliberate movement, Garrett lowered his gun. His heart was heavy, but the burden felt strangely lighter now. He wasn't sure if he had made the right choice, but he knew it was the only choice he could live with. Billy stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing the significance of Garrett's decision. Then, with a nod, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving Garrett standing alone in the quiet aftermath of their encounter. The night hung thick around Garrett, the moonlight casting long shadows on the ground as Billy disappeared into the darkness. Garrett remained still, his hands still trembling from the weight of the decision he had just made. The sounds of the world continued around him, the rustling of leaves, the distant hooves of horses, and the soft crackle of the fire behind him. But in that moment, all of it seemed far away. For the first time in years, Garrett felt a deep sense of emptiness. He had spent so long chasing Billy, convinced that capturing him, bringing him to justice, would somehow heal the wounds of their past. But now, with Billy walking away, he felt no sense of victory, no satisfaction from fulfilling his duty. Instead, there was only a deep, gnawing sadness. What had it all been for? Billy the Kid was still alive, and Garrett had let him go. The law demanded that Billy be captured, but Garrett knew that the law was a fragile thing, easily broken, easily bent. He had been living for the law, but now, with Billy out there, free once more, Garrett realized that perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps the law couldn't solve everything. Perhaps it was just another cage, another set of chains that bound men to a fate they didn't choose. As Garrett stood there, lost in his thoughts, a voice broke the silence behind him. "Are you going to let him get away again?" It was a familiar voice, one that had haunted Garrett's past, the voice of his deputy, Sam. Sam had been with him since the beginning, part of the team that had pursued Billy relentlessly. But there was something different in Sam's tone now. It was more than just frustration. It was betrayal. Garrett turned slowly, his eyes meeting Sam's. Sam's expression was hard, his hands clenched at his sides as if ready to lash out. "You had him, Garrett. You had him right there, and you let him go. Why?" Garrett opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. He had no defense, no explanation that could make sense of what he had just done. All he could do was stand there, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a stone. "Why?" Sam repeated, his voice rising. "What was it? You felt sorry for him? You thought you could save him?" Garrett's eyes narrowed, and his hand instinctively reached for his gun, but he didn't draw it. There was no need. Sam wasn't an enemy. Not yet. Still, the bitterness in his voice stung more than anything Garrett had ever heard. "I didn't let him go because I felt sorry for him, Sam. I let him go because I couldn't bring myself to kill him." Sam's face twisted in disbelief. "What are you saying? You're telling me you couldn't kill him? After everything he's done? After all the people he's killed?" Garrett's gaze softened, his grip tightening around his gun. "You think I didn't know that? You think I don't know how many lives Billy's taken? But you don't understand, Sam. I've spent my whole life chasing after this ghost. I've seen him as a criminal, a monster, a fugitive. But when I looked into his eyes tonight, I saw something else. I saw the man I once knew, the man I thought I could trust. And I couldn't bring myself to end it. Not like that." Sam stepped back, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're a fool, Garrett. You had him right there. He's a killer, a criminal. He's the reason this land is crawling with outlaws, and you let him walk away." "I didn't let him walk away, Sam," Garrett said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "I just couldn't end it. Not like that." Sam didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at Garrett, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You've lost your way, Garrett. You used to be a man of principle. You used to believe in justice. But now, you've let your feelings get in the way. You've let your past get in the way." Garrett didn't have an answer for that. Sam was right. His emotions, his history with Billy, had clouded his judgment. But in his heart, he knew that Sam's anger wasn't the thing that troubled him most. It was the emptiness inside him. The feeling that perhaps he had made a mistake that couldn't be undone. Billy the Kid had slipped through his fingers again, and this time, Garrett didn't know if there would be a next time. There was no more pursuit, no more chase. Billy was free, and Garrett was left to pick up the pieces of a broken past. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The tension between them was palpable, each man trapped in his own version of the truth, unable to bridge the gap between them. Finally, Sam spoke again, his voice quieter but still sharp. "I'll go after him, Garrett. I'll find him, and I'll bring him in. You've lost your edge, you've let him slip away, and now it's up to me." Garrett turned to face him, his expression hardening. "No, Sam. This is my responsibility. I failed, but I won't let you make the same mistake I did. We're done with this. You stay here." Sam didn't say anything more. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night like a shadow, leaving Garrett standing alone, haunted by the choices he had made. As Garrett stood there, the weight of his decision crushing him, he wondered if there was any redemption left for him. If he could ever forgive himself for letting Billy go, for allowing the past to cloud his sense of justice. He didn't have the answers. He didn't know what the future held. All he knew was that the price of his decision had been paid, and it was a price he would have to carry for the rest of his life. The morning after Billy the Kid's escape, the weight of Garrett's decision lingered like a fog over his mind. His hands, calloused from years of gripping his gun, felt strangely empty. It wasn't the absence of the weapon that made them feel this way. It was the absence of certainty, of direction. For the first time, Garrett questioned everything he had believed in. The quiet of the morning was broken only by the distant crowing of roosters and the rustling of wind through the trees. Garrett stood outside his cabin, his eyes scanning the horizon, but his mind was somewhere far from there. He couldn't escape the image of Billy, his old friend, walking away into the night. It was as though that moment had branded itself into Garrett's soul. "Did I do the right thing?" he whispered to himself, though he knew there was no answer. He had let Billy go. The law had told him that there was no excuse for this. But deep down, Garrett wasn't sure if he had chosen the right path. Maybe Billy had made his choices, and those choices had led him down a dark road. But Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that they had both been victims of the same unforgiving world. He walked aimlessly through the woods surrounding his cabin, the cool air biting at his skin. His boots crunched on the frost-covered ground as his thoughts swirled in a cycle of regret. What would the townspeople think when they found out Billy had escaped once again? Would they accuse Garrett of failing? Of betraying the law? Garrett stopped at a small creek that ran through the forest, the water flowing slowly, mirroring his thoughts. He knelt down, dipping his fingers into the cold water, watching the ripples as they spread outward. There was something symbolic about the creek. The water was steady, moving forward, but it was also shaped by the rocks beneath its surface. The course of the stream could be redirected, but it always found a way to keep flowing. Just like life. No matter how much Garrett tried to steer it, life seemed to slip through his fingers. He sighed, the weight of his duty pressing on his chest. He had been a man of the law for so long. It had been his identity. But now, in the stillness of the early morning, Garrett couldn't help but wonder, what if the law wasn't enough? What if there was something more to life than following the rules? As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, a figure emerged from the trees. It was Sam. Garrett tensed, his hand instinctively resting on his gun, but Sam raised a hand, signaling he meant no harm. "I figured I'd find you here," Sam said quietly, his voice rough from the journey. "You've been out here for hours." Garrett nodded but didn't speak. He didn't have the energy to explain himself to Sam. Not right now. He didn't have the answers. He wasn't sure he ever would. "You know, I've been thinking," Sam said, his gaze steady on Garrett. Maybe you were right about letting him go." Garrett looked up sharply, surprised by Sam's words. "What do you mean?" Sam took a step forward, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. "Billy's been a ghost for both of us. We've been chasing him for so long that we forgot what we were really chasing. Was it justice, or was it something else?" Garrett frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying we've both been living in the past, Garrett," Sam said softly. "We've been fighting battles that are over, holding on to ghosts that we can't control anymore. You let Billy go, but maybe, just maybe, that was the right thing to do. Maybe the world doesn't need more bloodshed. Maybe it needs forgiveness." Garrett stood motionless, processing Sam's words. He had been so consumed by his duty, by his pursuit of justice, that he had forgotten what it meant to be human. He had forgotten the value of compassion, of understanding. Maybe Sam was right. Maybe Billy's fate was already sealed, and the only way forward was to let go of the past. The weight in Garrett's chest seemed to lighten, ever so slightly. There was no simple answer to the choices he had made. But perhaps, just maybe, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about living with the consequences of those choices and learning to live with peace instead of rage. "You think I should have let him go?" Garrett asked, his voice raw with emotion. Sam nodded. "I do. He's not the same Billy you once knew, and neither are we. We've both changed. It's time we accepted that." Garrett looked out over the forest, the trees stretching toward the sky. He had been trying to force the past into something it wasn't. He had been trying to force the law into something it wasn't. Life was messy. It was never as simple as right or wrong, good or bad. There were shades of gray, and perhaps that was the hardest truth to accept. For a long time, Garrett had been convinced that bringing Billy to justice would bring him peace. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that peace wouldn't come through violence or punishment. Peace would come through letting go of the ghosts of the past, of the anger that had driven him for so long. Billy the Kid had been a part of his life, and now he was gone. But Billy's story was not just his own. It was the story of a world that had failed him, a world that had shaped him into the man he had become. Garrett turned back to Sam. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time to stop chasing shadows." Sam gave him a small, understanding nod. "Maybe it's time to live, Garrett." As they stood there together, Garrett finally let go of the weight that had been pressing on him for so long. The past was behind him. It was time to move forward, whatever that meant. The days following Billy's escape were heavy for Garrett. As he rode through the sprawling desert landscape, the weight of his choices pressed on him, never letting go. The world around him seemed indifferent to his internal struggle, but inside, he carried the enormity of the decision he had made. He had let Billy the Kid go, and now he had to live with that. The law had told him one thing, but his heart had told him another. Could there truly be redemption for a man who had broken so many rules, so many laws? Garrett had always believed that redemption came through action, that it could be earned through the pursuit of justice. But now, as he faced the vast, unforgiving desert, he wondered if he had been wrong all along. The winds howled, and the sun beat down harshly on his back, but none of that seemed to matter. Garrett knew that no matter how far he rode, the questions would follow him. He had been chasing Billy for so long, and now that he had let him go, Garrett was left with nothing but the past. The endless pursuit had consumed him. He had poured all of his energy into capturing Billy, but now that the fugitive had slipped through his fingers, Garrett realized how much of himself he had lost along the way. He was no longer the man he once was. The law, which had always been a guiding light, now seemed like an oppressive force, binding him to a world of black and white morality that no longer made sense. As Garrett rode into the small town of Fort Sumner, the weight on his chest grew heavier. This was where it had all come full circle. This was where Billy had once been captured. The town was quiet now, its streets deserted in the heat of the afternoon. It had been a long time since the dust of the Old West had felt so suffocating, so isolating. Garrett dismounted and walked toward the local saloon, the sound of his boots echoing in the empty street. He needed to face the town, to face the men who had once looked to him for answers, for justice. But what could he tell them now? That he had let Billy go? That he had chosen mercy over vengeance? Inside the saloon, the usual patrons were absent, replaced by a few familiar faces. The bartender, a stout man with a grizzled face, looked up as Garrett entered. His expression was neutral, but Garrett could see the curiosity in his eyes. "Garrett," the bartender said, wiping a glass with a rag. "You're a long way from home." Garrett walked up to the bar and leaned against it, his eyes scanning the room. "Just passing through," he replied, his voice heavy. He didn't want to say too much, not yet, but the bartender, sensing the weight in Garrett's voice, didn't press him further. "Word is," the bartender continued, "Billy's still out there. People are talking." Garrett's jaw clenched at the mention of Billy's name. It felt like a knife in his side. He had spent years chasing that name, and now, even in his absence, it still haunted him. "I know," Garrett said quietly. "I let him go." The bartender paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to understand what Garrett was saying. "You what?" "I let him go," Garrett repeated, this time louder, more final. "Billy the Kid is still alive, and it's not the law that will catch him. It's something else." The bartender didn't respond immediately. He set down the glass he was cleaning and looked Garrett over, his face hardening. "You let him go?" the bartender asked, incredulity and judgment mingling in his tone. "After all the men he's killed, after everything he's done, you let him slip away?" Garrett's hand tightened on the edge of the bar, his fingers digging into the wood as if trying to ground himself. "I couldn't bring myself to kill him," he said, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. "I couldn't do it." The bartender shook his head slowly. "You should have finished what you started. He's a killer, and killers don't deserve mercy." Garrett's heart twisted. He had heard those words many times before, spoken by men who didn't know Billy the way he did. He had heard it from the townspeople, the lawmen, even his own deputy, Sam. But for Garrett, it wasn't about mercy. It was about understanding. About seeing the human being beneath the outlaw, the boy who had once been his friend. "You don't understand," Garrett said, his voice low. "Billy wasn't always like this. He wasn't born a killer. He became one because of a world that gave him no other choice." The bartender met his eyes with cold indifference. "The world's a tough place, Garrett. But you can't let that excuse the things Billy did." "I'm not excusing anything," Garrett replied, his voice hardening. "I'm just saying, it wasn't black and white. I couldn't just kill him and walk away like nothing happened." The bartender didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, he turned his attention to a bottle of whiskey behind the bar, pouring a generous amount into a glass and sliding it over to Garrett. "Maybe you're right," the bartender muttered, "but it doesn't change the fact that he's still out there, still a danger to everyone, and you've just let him go." Garrett took the glass and downed the whiskey in one long swallow, the burning liquid offering him no comfort. It didn't matter what the bartender or anyone else thought. Garrett knew that he had made the only choice he could live with, and that was all that mattered now. As he stood there staring into the empty glass, Garrett realized something. The law could bring Billy in, but it could never bring peace. Peace wasn't something that could be chased down or captured. It was something that came only when you stopped running. When you stopped trying to force life into something, it wasn't. Billy the Kid had escaped again, but Garrett knew the real battle was over. The law had no hold over him anymore. He had to find his own path, just as Billy had to find his. And as Garrett stepped out into the quiet streets of Fort Sumner once more, he realized that the road ahead was one he would have to walk alone. The days after the encounter with Billy, the Kid felt like a blur to Garrett. He spent his time riding through the rugged terrain of New Mexico, each mile feeling heavier than the last. The weight of his decision pressed on him relentlessly, like an anchor he could not escape. He had chosen mercy over justice, and now he was left to grapple with the consequences of that choice. Garrett had never been one to dwell on regrets. His entire life had been defined by duty and conviction, by the belief that he was doing the right thing. But now, with Billy slipping through his fingers once again, he wondered if his entire sense of right and wrong had been built on shaky ground. As he rode, the landscape seemed to mirror his internal turmoil. The vast stretches of desert, the jagged mountains in the distance all felt cold and indifferent, and it was as if the world itself was telling him that no matter what he did, he would never be free from his past. The faces of those who had died because of Billy haunted him, as did the memory of the boy he had once known. The boy who had been so full of promise before the harsh realities of the West had shaped him into the outlaw he became. Garrett's thoughts were interrupted by a distant sound, hooves beating the earth in a steady rhythm. He turned his head to see a rider approaching, dust kicking up behind the horse's hooves. As the rider drew closer, Garrett recognized him as Sam, his former deputy, his face grim with the burden of the task he had been given. Sam rode up to Garrett, his horse slowing as he neared. "Garrett," Sam said, his voice tight, as if he had been carrying this conversation with him for miles. "We need to talk." Garrett's eyes narrowed, and he nodded, signaling for Sam to dismount. The two men stood facing each other, the space between them filled with unsaid words, unsaid accusations. Sam had always been loyal, but there was something in his eyes now that made Garrett uneasy. Sam had been with him through it all, chasing Billy, hunting him down, but now Sam's loyalty felt less certain. The bond between them had been fractured, and Garrett knew that there would be no easy fix. "You should have killed him," Sam said, his voice sharp. "Billy's still out there, still a danger to everyone. You let him walk away. You failed." Garrett flinched at the harshness of Sam's words, the truth in them like a knife to his chest. He had failed, hadn't he? He had failed to bring Billy to justice, failed to stop him from continuing his rampage. And now, that failure would follow him like a shadow. "I know, Sam," Garrett replied quietly, his voice hoarse. "I know I failed, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't kill him. Not after everything." Sam's expression hardened, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're weak, Garrett. I've never seen you like this. You've always been the one who did what needed to be done, no matter what. But now you're just making excuses." Garrett's gaze dropped to the ground, his shoulders slumping under the weight of Sam's words. "I'm not making excuses, Sam. I'm trying to tell you that sometimes there's more to it than just right and wrong. Sometimes it's about the people you've known, the people you've cared about. Billy wasn't just a criminal to me. He was a friend, and I couldn't bring myself to end his life." Sam shook his head in disbelief. "So what now, Garrett? What are you going to do? Let him keep running? Let him kill more people?" Garrett's jaw tightened, and he met Sam's eyes, his gaze resolute. "I'll find him, but not in the way you think. I'm not going to chase him down like an animal anymore. I'm going to talk to him. I'm going to find out what happened to the boy I once knew." Sam stared at him for a moment, as if trying to understand, but then he simply turned away. "You're making a mistake," he muttered, his voice laced with disappointment. "You can't fix him, Garrett. He's too far gone." Garrett watched as Sam mounted his horse and rode off, the dust kicking up behind him, leaving Garrett alone with his thoughts. It felt like a final betrayal, a rift between them that would never be healed. Sam had always been a man of action, a man who believed in the law above all else. Garrett, on the other hand, was beginning to realize that the law wasn't the answer. There were no simple solutions, no easy fixes. The road ahead was uncertain, and Garrett knew that his journey wasn't over. He had to find Billy, but he couldn't do it the way Sam wanted. He couldn't keep chasing him like a criminal. The man Billy had become was a reflection of the harsh world they had both lived in. Garrett had to face that truth if he ever hoped to bring Billy to justice. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the landscape, Garrett made his decision. He would go after Billy one last time, not with his gun drawn, but with an open mind. He would offer Billy a chance at redemption, even if it meant facing the truth of his own failures. But as Garrett rode into the night, The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him. He wasn't sure if he could save Billy, or if Billy even wanted to be saved. But he knew one thing for certain. This was the only road left to travel. It was the road of forgiveness, the road of understanding, and the road of redemption. And for Garrett, it was the only road that mattered now. The road was long and unforgiving, stretching endlessly across the barren landscape, much like Garrett's own journey. With each mile, the weight of his decision to let Billy go seemed to grow heavier, the echoes of Sam's anger still ringing in his ears. Garrett hadn't expected things to be easy. He knew that no matter where he went or how far he rode, the past would always find a way to catch up with him. As he pushed forward, the memories of Billy, the boy he had once known, the friend he had lost, haunted him. Billy had been reckless, sure, but underneath the bravado and the outlaw persona, there was something more. Garrett could still see traces of the boy who had sat beside him around campfires, laughing and sharing stories of dreams that would never come true. Billy had always had a fire in him, a wild energy that set him apart from others, and Garrett had once believed that fire was something worth protecting. But somewhere along the way, that fire had turned into something dangerous. It had consumed Billy, twisted him into a figure of legend, a man more myth than reality. But even now, Garrett couldn't fully let go of the memory of the young boy who had once been his friend. The wind howled as Garrett continued his journey, and the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land. He hadn't slept much, his mind too busy grappling with the enormity of what he was about to do. What if Billy didn't want to be found? What if the years of running had made him too hardened, too distant from the person Garrett had once known? And what if, after all this, Billy still saw him as the enemy? A part of Garrett feared that his efforts would be in vain, that he would find Billy only to have the past, with all its pain and bitterness, rise up between them like a wall. But another part of him, the part that still clung to the belief that there was some good left in Billy, fueled his determination. The world was a complicated place. It wasn't simply about right and wrong, good and evil. There were shades of gray, spaces where the law and morality blurred. Garrett had seen it in the eyes of the men he'd locked up and the ones he'd let go. He had seen it in Billy, a man shaped by a cruel world, a man who had made his own choices but had also been shaped by forces beyond his control. When Garrett finally arrived at the small cabin in the hills where he had tracked Billy years before, the sun had set, leaving only the pale glow of the moon to light his way. He dismounted, his boots heavy on the ground as he approached the door. The place was deserted, a shadow of what it had once been. But there was no mistaking it. The place felt like home to Garrett. It was the same place where he had last seen Billy, where their paths had diverged, and the last remnants of their friendship had burned away. Garrett hesitated for a moment, the door hanging ajar in front of him. The choice was in his hands now, whether to face Billy to try and make things right, or to turn away and let the past consume them both. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The cabin was cold, its walls weathered by time. There was nothing left but the echoes of the life Billy had once lived here, faded marks on the floor where furniture had been, the remnants of old memories. But there was something else in the air, something familiar. A figure stepped out from the shadows. Billy. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, looking at each other across the threshold of the cabin. The years had not been kind to Billy. His face was harder, more worn, but the eyes were still the same. There was a fire there, a spark of the boy Garrett had once known. "I didn't think you'd come," Billy said, his voice rough from years of disuse. He didn't sound angry, nor was there any fear in his tone. He simply sounded tired. Garrett stood motionless, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't what he had expected. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, how it would play out, what he would say. But now that he was here standing in front of Billy, all of his plans seemed insignificant. The only thing that mattered now was the moment, and what came next. "I had to come," Garrett said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the years between them. "I needed to see you, needed to understand why." Billy's expression shifted, but it wasn't surprise. It was more like resignation, as though he had expected this moment to come for a long time. "I can't change what I did, Garrett," Billy said softly, his eyes flickering toward the ground. "I can't undo the past. I know who I am now." Garrett took a step forward, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. "It's not about the past, Billy. It's about understanding, about seeing what we've become, and deciding if there's any way to make it right." Billy's eyes flickered to him, and for the first time in years, Garrett saw something more than the outlaw. He saw a man who had lived with the weight of his choices, just as Garrett had. "I don't know if it's possible to make it right," Billy said quietly. "Maybe it's too late for that." Garrett reached into his coat and pulled out a small flask. He offered it to Billy, a gesture of old familiarity, something that had once bonded them. Billy hesitated for a moment before accepting the flask. He took a long sip, and then passed it back to Garrett. "I don't know if I can be saved," Billy said, his voice rougher now. "But I'm done running, Garrett. I've spent my whole life trying to outrun my own demons. But I can't outrun you forever." Garrett stared at Billy, and in that moment, he saw the truth. Billy had never been running from him. He had been running from himself. "I don't have the answers, Billy," Garrett said quietly. "I don't know if we can fix what's been broken, but maybe we can stop running. At least for a while." For the first time, Garrett felt a glimmer of hope, small and fragile, but there. Maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past. Maybe it was about living with it, learning from it, and finding a way forward together. Billy looked at Garrett, and for a brief moment there was no law, no badge, no bloodshed. There was just the two of them, lost, but not alone,